Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a yoga teacher at the advanced 500-hour level. I am a spiritual educator. I am an ordained minister. I'm a kirtan artist, musician, amongst other things. And today I wanted to talk about dosing. Before I get into the talk though, I do want to thank the community who makes these talks possible, and those are my patrons on Patreon. You can go ahead and check out the links below and become a member if you'd like to help support the work that I do. I don't like paywalls when it comes to spiritual content. I don't like the idea that those who have enough money get to have access to spiritual teaching and those that don't have access to it. So I like the kind of old school spiritual approach where those who have a lot of means and really want to support a teacher or a spiritual institution, they might give a lot. And then people who don't have any means, they may not give anything at all. And yet everyone has access to the teaching. So I know this is an unusual approach in this day and age. But I like to work without a paywall. So if you want to help me do that, check out the links. You can also make one-time donations. You can become a patron for free. So you get content to everything I put over there. But you can also do it for as little as $1 a month. But that monthly amount really allows me to budget time and resources, really make this a part of the work that I do. So anyway, thanks to my patrons. And again, if you'd like to join, check out the links below. Okay, so today we want to look at dosing. This is something I've been talking a lot about in my yoga classes in person. And I thought it'd be nice to document my thoughts and share it with a wider audience here on YouTube and Patreon. So what is dosing? Well, I think we all have some idea about it. Most of us think of it in terms of medicine, and that's where I get the term from. This isn't a term that any of my teachers use, but it is relevant to any kind of spiritual practice. So how much are we using? One of my teachers, Paul Grilly, the famous yin teacher, he says in one of his offerings, you can always have too much of a good thing. So how much is the right amount? This is the question of dosing. How much do I take? How much do I use? So it's basically applies to medicine, but it also applies to spiritual practice. A dose of something can be too much, too little, or just right. If you have too little, it's ineffective. Nothing is going to happen. If it's too much, you risk injury or even death when it comes to medicine. And we could say even some spiritual practices. There are some spiritual practices that people might say, if you do this incorrectly, you might actually cause serious injury or death. And then just right is what we're aiming for. That's what we want. That's what we want to see. Then we're going to have the desired effect that we want. Again, whether it's medicine or spiritual practice, but obviously I'm not a doctor, so I'm not here to talk about medicine, but I am here to talk about spiritual practices. So why am I talking about dosing? Well, as I already alluded to, spiritual practices require dosing. It's not enough to just say, oh, I'm going to meditate and sit down for 1 minute and expect to have the kind of experience that Eckhart Tolle has had, or Byron Katie has had, or the Siddhartha Gautama had, the Buddha, the historical Buddha. All right, the Buddha, it was said he sat down and meditated for, I think it was 6 days straight before he had his great realization. All right, are we willing to do that? Are we ready to do that? If not, then we may not have the same kind of experience that he had. Is a minute a waste of time? I don't know. It kind of depends on other factors. But again, a minute, a day, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 years. How much do I need to meditate? How often? Okay? So spiritual practices, whether we like it or not, whether we use this term or not, require dosing. So a teacher says, do this, this often, this long, whatever it is, that is a dose. So if the dose is too low, the practice will be ineffective. If it's too high, we may experience adverse side effects, okay? So how do we dose our spiritual practices? Well, there are a few different factors to keep in mind. Time, how long are you doing the practice, okay? Intensity, how much effort are you putting into the practice? Repetition, how many times are you doing the practice? And then frequency. So depending on the practice, some of these are more or less important. In fact, maybe even some of them may not be relevant. But in general, those are our 4 parameters. So let's look at each one individually. Time. How long are you doing the practice? So again, let's think about meditation. Do I sit down for 1 minute? Do I sit down for 20 minutes? Do I sit down for 30 minutes? How long is that particular sit? How long am I sitting there on my cushion meditating? Very relevant, because too little, again, probably nothing is going to happen. Too much, we can injure or hurt ourselves, okay? Again, so time, very important factor. Intensity, how much effort are you making? Again, depending on the type of practice. Some practices I teach, I really invite people to explore effortlessness. And in a sense, the more effortless you are, the more relevant it is. But there are other practices I teach where if you aren't willing to make an effort, you're not going to get the benefit. Like power yoga is a good example of that. There's a certain kind of physical exertion that is required to get the benefits of a power yoga practice. If you approach power yoga with a sort of physical surrender, you will get no benefit from the practice. Whereas something like yin yoga, which I also teach, requires a more surrendered approach most of the time. But again, in the wisdom of my teacher Paul Grilly, he likes to say there's an exception to every rule. So even in yin yoga, there are times where we need to make an effort. Even in power yoga, there are elements of surrender, and there is the relaxation at the end where we want to completely let go. So again, if we're too broad and too black and white in our thinking, we will not get the most out of our practices. Okay, so that's intensity. How much effort am I making over the time that I'm doing the practice? Okay, so again, time, intensity. Next is repetition. How many times do you do the practice in one sitting? So I teach Zen meditation, and in Zen, usually a full session is considered basically 20-30 minutes of seated meditation called Zazen, and then you have 5 or 10 minutes of walking meditation called Kinhin, and then you have again another 20 or 30 minutes of seated meditation. So you would have 2 sessions of seated meditation, and then you have basically 1 session of walking meditation, okay? So again, there's the repetition there. So how many times are you doing something? When it comes to, say, flow yoga, with power yoga, you usually start with a few repetitions of Surya Namaskar A and B, sun salutations. So usually you would do 3 or 5, 6 repetitions of these. So again, in one sort of session, one sitting, how many are you doing? Okay, so repetition, again, important concept. And then frequency. Frequency is how often are you doing the practice. Now, this isn't the same as repetition. It might sound like it's the same thing, but repetition is how many times you're doing it in one sitting. So I would do, say in a power class, 3 sun A's, 3 sun B's. Then the next time I'm doing power yoga, I would do the same thing, but the next time would be the next day or 2 days later or the next week, right? So the frequency, this is again a very important concept. So if I'm doing power yoga once a week, in my opinion, that's not going to be very effective. If I'm doing power yoga twice a week, I think this is closer to being effective. The minimum that I really recommend for a practice like that is going to be around 3 times a week, okay? Now, I know that's not possible for everybody, and there are other things that you could do for exercise, but again, if we're just looking at this, and let's say that was the only option available to you, and if you're talking to me, I would say, okay, you want to do about 3 times a week. And of course, there can be specifics that are different. If you're injured, if you have a specific situation, then maybe fewer would be appropriate, okay? So an important consideration is, what is the desired outcome? I think a lot of times people on a spiritual path, they just start doing practices willy-nilly. They're not even really sure what it is that the outcome should be. So there is a caveat to this that I'll talk about toward the end of the video, but basically, like, what are we expecting to happen? With power yoga, for instance, I would want to see a gradual regulation of the nervous system, being able to create equanimity, a sense of calmness, peace, and centeredness in the face of challenging situations. With yin yoga, I'd want the muscles in the body to relax and the joints and connective tissue to become healthier, stronger, more mobile, okay? So these are just some examples of what we might be looking for. And if you're doing practices and you're not sure what the outcome should be, then you might want to talk with the teacher who gave you these practices. So it can be hard to know if you're doing your practices correctly if you do not know what the outcome should be. And again, I find many times people just start practices, they're not really sure what the outcome should be. Having said that, spiritual practices tend to produce long-term as opposed to short-term results. This is a very important concept. So if I do a power yoga class and I leave the class and I expect to immediately be stronger and feel more equanimity, more peace in stressful situations, it's probably not going to happen. In fact, some spiritual practices in the short term create the opposite effect of the long term. Okay, so maybe I do power yoga and afterwards I feel tired, I feel weak, I feel discombobulated. Okay, that's the short-term effect. So thinking of your spiritual practices and not looking too short-term, right? Not sitting down and meditating for 20 minutes and then getting up and expecting to have an experience like the Buddha had, to find lasting peace. This is just unrealistic, okay? So what is a reasonable time frame? Well, there are a few that I can recommend. Some people say that if you want to develop a new habit, you should do it for 21 days. I've also heard a month or 30 days is a good measure. And then I think in some spiritual traditions, like in the Christian tradition, it was said that Jesus went into the desert for 40 days. Okay, so that might be another measure. I don't have any scientific data about, how long it takes the brain to rewire or to change. That's really what we're doing with most spiritual practices. We're actually rewiring the nervous system. But again, I'm not sure. I would say if you really want to be on the safe side, then 40 days is a good time. That's kind of the longest time frame. And I'm not saying that in 40 days you're going to be Buddha or enlightened or whatever. Again, it depends on the dosing. Are you meditating every day for 40 days? Are you meditating for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour? How many sessions are you doing in one? How many repetitions are you doing? And then how many times a day are you doing that? Okay, so all of these things are going to matter. But again, having said that, 40 days is not a bad marker. So 40 days of power yoga, are you feeling stronger? And again, 40 days of power yoga once a week, right? If you're counting the whole week, probably not a good measure. Because again, as someone who teaches power yoga, I would generally say once a week is not going to be effective. All right, sorry, but that's just my feeling on it. If you're doing 40 days of power yoga spread out over, I don't know how, once a week, I don't know what that comes out to. It's almost a year, right, to get to 40, because a year has 52 weeks. So considering if you did every single week, once a week, 40 days spread out over that time, I don't think that's going to be very effective, to be quite honest with you. Twice a week, again, better, but 3 times, for me, I think you're in the sweet spot. So 3 times a week, counting 40, then maybe you look and say, okay, am I beginning to experience some of what is being promised by what Doug said I should experience? Okay? So those, I think, are good measures. 21 days, a month, 40 days. These are probably some guideposts that you can use. All right? And then again, I don't think necessarily you will experience everything or the full expression of a spiritual practice. Many spiritual practices unfold over months, years, decades, or even lifetimes. I'm sorry that it's that way, but that is the way that it is. So again, being too quick to want to see results is not a good idea on this path. So ultimately, spiritual practice is not about outcomes, however, but knowing one's true nature and self-realization. And this is one of those paradoxes that there just really is no way around in spirituality. It is strange that we would do practices and have these different spiritual interventions when ultimately we're just trying to be ourselves. Now, when I say be ourselves, I'm not talking about your personality. I'm not talking about being, Douglas Johnson in my case. That isn't what I'm talking about. I am talking about realizing your true nature, which is if you interpret scriptures from different traditions in the right way, you could say that many, if not all, spiritual traditions really point to something like this deep realization of what is really going on here. Who am I really beyond this name, this body, these thoughts, these emotions? There's something there, but it can be hidden by all of this stuff. Now, spiritual practices, they have a lot of, you could say, side benefits, like power yoga, yin yoga generally makes us physically healthier, makes us feel more emotionally stable. It can have all kinds of benefits, but ultimately those benefits are side effects, if you will. They're like positive side effects. In the end, the real goal of spiritual practice is to realize one's true nature. And in the spirit of that, I have a summation of something from the Upanishads. Okay, and this is something that I heard first from Sarah Powers in one of her books. So here it is. Knowledge without practice is better than practice without knowledge. Now, this is something I find people in the yoga community often get wrong, because at least in this country, many people are teaching quote unquote yoga, mainly yoga postures, and they're not educating their students or the public about what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What are the expected benefits? Everyone just assumes in this country that it's quote unquote exercise, that you are working out, and the purpose is to lose weight, burn calories, and have a more physically fit body. Some people might also assume that there's a mental and emotional benefit as well, but they don't really understand the true purpose of yoga. Okay, so here we have it from the source, one of the Upanishads. Knowledge without practice is better than practice without knowledge. So if you're going to choose one or the other, it's better to know than it is to just blindly practice. Then, the second quote, knowledge with practice is better than knowledge without practice. So we see that while knowledge, if you're going to choose one or the other, it's better to know, but it's better to know and to practice. Okay, so again, that would be the preference. Just someone who says, well, I know this, I know that, but I don't practice, you know, that's better than just practicing without any knowledge, which is what most people in the States do, unfortunately. And it's not anyone's fault. It really is just where we are with yoga in the West. And maybe at some point it'll change. I don't know. But it's just sort of is what it is. Yoga is primarily driven by market forces or economics. And unfortunately, it does not produce the best results, or at least in my opinion, it hasn't produced the best results, at least not so far. So the final quote here is, resting in one's true nature is better than any practice or knowledge. And that is the key point. All spiritual practices, all spiritual interventions are ultimately about resting in one's true nature, self-realization. Okay, if you're not sure what that looks like or what that means, you can read Eckhart Tolle or Byron Katie. Many people throughout history have experienced this realization of their deepest nature, the fundamental ground of being. And this is ultimately what these practices are meant to do. We get distracted by our thoughts, by our emotions, by our bodies, by events and life. That happens to most of us. So most people find that they need an intervention, something to come in and help them refocus and change their perspective. For some people, a little bit of spiritual practice is all they need, and then they wake up. Other people, they need a lot of spiritual practice. And according to tradition, for most people, it's actually lifetimes. So even though you may do a lifetime of spiritual practice in this life, you may not realize your true nature in this lifetime, but you will still get benefits. That's the beautiful thing about spiritual practice, is even if you don't reach the ultimate goal, science is telling us this, right? There's so many benefits to something like a power yoga practice or a yin yoga practice or a meditation practice or chanting. All the things that I offer, these are things that are being verified in one way or another as having a lot of benefits for us that we can measure scientifically. I don't think we can measure self-realization, the benefits of that. I don't know. Maybe someone can come up with an experiment where we measure that. We take enlightened masters. I have no idea. But as far as I know, there probably isn't a lot of money or funding And I'm not sure that enlightened masters are necessarily interested in taking part in a study like that. Who knows? Maybe one day. But for now, there are things we can measure like health, longevity, maybe even happiness, right? I was reading a book about a gentleman who studies happiness, so maybe this is something we can measure. But in the end, spiritual practices are really to help us rest in our own true nature. This is something you could do spontaneously right now. There really isn't anything in your way in reality. But since most of us don't live in reality, we live in Maya or illusion or delusion. Because of that, most of us, it's just not possible for us to see our way clear in an instant. But it is possible, and I want to make that clear because sometimes I try and emphasize the amount of work and effort this path takes, because it does for many people. And so we want to be realistic, and we want to be willing to say, okay, I'm not going to do this for the short term. I'm going to make the effort and know that the results will be long term. But at the same time, I want to remind people that this is your true nature after all. Again, this isn't finding yourself, which is a very new age concept, right? I go to India on vacation, I travel around the ashrams, and I try and find myself. And maybe I realize, oh, I'm an artist, but I'm working as a lawyer. So I come back to the States, I quit my lawyer job, and I start painting. This isn't what I'm talking about. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but that is not the spiritual quest as defined in discovering your true nature. The true nature in me is the same as the true nature in you. It's the true nature of all of existence. It's not your personal true nature or your personal expression. Now, paradoxically, again, interestingly, usually when we find our true nature, we do express ourselves in our own unique way. We stop worrying about fitting in or pleasing others or trying to be some kind of cookie cutter. We really accept this expression for its uniqueness, and we allow it to be unique. We're not trying to make it unique. We're not trying to be anything anymore. It just is unique. Just like snowflakes. Everyone is different, and that's true of you too. So oddly, when we find our true nature, when we rest in our true nature, the personal expression is free to be what it is and who it is more fully. All right, everyone, I hope that made sense. I hope this is helpful. And as always, that is the intention here. Again, I could really use your help over on Patreon. If you're interested in contributing even a small amount monthly, that really does help out. You can also make one-time contributions through PayPal, Venmo, and you can also help just by liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting on YouTube. Reach out if you feel that I could help you. Otherwise, namaste and have a beautiful, beautiful day.